Okay, welcome to those who are joining us. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes for participants to be let into the webinar, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with now. Takes just a small amount of time, but hopefully we'll get started pretty quickly. I don't know why my name has come up twice. Okay. Okay, we're just up to about 39 attendees, so I think looks like it's just stopped in terms of people coming in. So yeah, let's get started. Well, welcome everybody to this webinar this evening, and thanks very much for coming along. I'm just trying to juggle between my two screens here. Just as a quick introduction, so this webinar is being hosted by the C&D Trade Union Advisory Group. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sam Mason. I'm a member of C&D Council and on the advisory group and a trade unionist. So just as a short introduction before we get to the main speakers, I just wanted to give a bit of a background for the impetus for this meeting tonight, which, as obviously we put in the information for the event, was really on the back of the announcement of over 1,000 jobs in Derby in support of the AUKUS agreement, which was announced in 2021, which was termed at the time by Boris Johnson as an enhanced trilateral security partnership between Australia, the UK and the US. And it's mainly geared towards Australia getting nuclear-powered attack submarines. In addition, in 2022, Rolls-Royce announced the creation of 200 apprenticeships in their submarine division as part of a new nuclear skills academy based in Derby, which will be supported by industry and education experts, including the Nuclear Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, the National College for Nuclear, the University of Derby and Derby City Council. An initiative that, as has been put out in the publicity, is seen as putting Derby at the heart of a new nuclear renaissance. And of course, Rolls-Royce in Derby has been the provider of nuclear power to the Royal Navy nuclear submarines for over half a century, and there's a long history of fighting for alternative jobs in the city and in the East Midlands region. So this webinar is really looking at the developments in Derby, and I'm really pleased to have Moira Jean from Derby C&D to give us some of the background to that, who we'll go to in a minute to start us off. But also linking that into obviously the wider support for war and military spending, and looking at how we can discuss how we can build our campaigns to put forward a jobs alternative based on a just transition for defence sector workers that focus on decarbonisation and a peace economy. And again, we're good to have speakers that are going to address all those points. So I think without further ado, I will hand over to Moira from Derby C&D to tell us a bit about the situation in Derby, what Derby C&D have been doing, and just to give a sense of what's happening on the ground from there. Thank you. Over to you, Moira.
Well, thank you. I haven't really got an awful lot more to say because, you know, you've explained, we had the showing of the film The Plan, with a really good discussion afterwards, but unfortunately not so many people from Derby were among those good speakers. I mean, we've got a difficult situation as far as C&D is concerned, C&D Derby is concerned. I mean, Rolls-Royce is a big employer in Derby. we used to regularly have demonstrations on the Raynesway outside their main headquarters plant at Raynesway, protesting against the fact they were making the nuclear propulsion elements for Trident. However, first of all, people wanted, when we heard about the announcement of these of this work, we wanted to have some demonstrations straight away. Just do people realise that what the work is about? Because maybe they don't all, because some people are quite split, because some people see it as green issue, because they're actually saying that they're making expansion of the submarine sector, etc. But what they're actually saying they're doing is green energy from nuclear. That's what they're selling it as at the moment. And even the climate change activists locally, with whom we've been talking a bit, are split because of that. We, as I say, we used to have the demos outside on Raynesway, but we're being discouraged from doing that at the moment, because 1,100 jobs and a huge expansion in these times, not just post-COVID, but with the downturn economically, jobs are important. And we have tried to quietly do a little bit of on the street talking to people with flyers. But I'm hoping that some of you today are going to advise us about how to continue here. I think that's probably all I need to say just now, Sam, isn't it? Just to maybe say the film, The Plan, was shown at Quad in Derby with a good turnout of people there. And it was talking about, I've seen it before. I think I saw it at National CND conference one time about, alternative uses for people's skills and the equipment they've already got. But the two people who did attend from Rolls-Royce didn't really add very much to the discussion, and are really much more concerned about holding on to their jobs. Okay, I think that's all I need to say to start, Sam.
That's great. Thank you, Maura. It's just important to give a bit of the context on the ground as well, because obviously you've got a difficult job in Derby trying to bring a campaign, and obviously what we're trying to do is to, whilst it's a local issue, obviously this is clearly a national issue, and how we can support you. So yeah, just to encourage people, so I should have said we will have a time for questions at the end after the three speakers, and obviously if you want to use the Q&A to make any introductions or comments or put questions, then feel free to do that. So I'm now going to hand over to Sean Burnell, who is a member of the UCU National Executive Committee, and Sean was the mover of the UCU Congress motion that was calling for Russian troops to be withdrawn from Ukraine and for the UK government to stop sending arms. So over to you, Sean, to talk about that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I think the importance and the significance of any and every peace campaign at the moment is so important, and particularly the role that CND has played for so many decades so successfully, hopefully will continue to do so in the light of what is taking place not just in Ukraine but around the world. And you see the wars taking place, and the threat of nuclear weapons being used in some of those wars is more real now than perhaps any time as I can remember. So I think the role of CND, as usual, can play such an important role. And by the way, people can see my background. I'm on holiday here, so that's I'm in a caravan in Dartmoor, so hence the background. Well, first, I want to say two things, really. I mean, first, I'll say something about the whole 2 points, really. One, about how we can start to win arguments about peace in relation to Ukraine, and more generally, it seems to me. And secondly, I think which this meeting really is about, and that is, of course, how we start to convince workers in the arms industries and the energy industry that peace campaigners and environmental activists aren't the enemy to those who work in those industries, and how we can go about to convince those workers which may, I believe, do understand, in fact, have an interest in supporting the kinds of arguments that we put forward and offer, as opposed to the warmongers and the pro-imperialist argument, which is gaining in confidence since the war in Ukraine has taken place. I mean, remember, and we only have to look at what happened at the TUC Congress this year with the motion that was passed by the GMB, calling for more arms expenditure, and that was supported by the TUC. Really quite a shocking motion, in my view, to be passed. And I'll try and say something about that towards the end, how we can start to roll back that situation. So, but first of all, I'll start with UCU. I mean, as I say, I'm a member of UCU. I've worked in the further education sector in North London. I'm a GCSE English teacher full time, and I'm on the national executive of our union. And the motion, actually, there were two motions passed at the Congress. One was, which was a straightforward, uncontroversial one, which was a solidarity motion with Ukraine, which also talked about the opposing all forms of imperialisms and so on and so forth. And myself and many others supported that motion. However, the motion which myself and Brighton University submitted and carried was which created a bit more controversy and was one, and that we argued for three things. First of all, as Sam said, it argued for call for the troops out, Russian troops, to be immediately pulled out of Ukraine. Secondly, no to NATO expansionism, because what we feel is that the war is not simply one of Ukraine, a national struggle for independence against the massive power of Russian imperialism. That national struggle is subsumed by a wider struggle, which is, of course, a struggle of different imperialisms, not just Russian imperialism, but also NATO, an expansion led by Britain and America and so on, to expand increasingly eastwards the NATO alliance. The recent, we've just heard on the news about Sweden being attempted to expand that organisation. And the third thing we called upon is that the British government not to send troops to, yes, definitely not send troops, but to send more arms to Ukraine. Again, we had to look what's happened more recently to see not only depleted uranium, but of course the United States and Biden are promising to send and supply, in fact, the Ukrainian government with cluster bombs, and something which by many legal organizations as being a war crime for using such horrific weapons, which indiscriminately kill civilians as well as obviously troops and so on and so forth. So that's the motions of the three elements of the motion that we put, and we carried that motion. And I want to just quickly go through why I think that. I think the argument about NATO expansion, I think increasingly in our years, it accepted that NATO is an imperialist organization. It's not a defensive one; it's an offensive one, set up in 1947 to try and push forward the demands and the ambitions and agendas of the West inside Eastern Europe. But I think the key argument, which was a debate, and there's a real debate inside the union, a lot of middle ground inside the union, and this debate, it was a very serious debate, and done very, very well, I thought, at the time. And the debate really centered around, how do we get peace in the Ukraine? Is it the case by piling in more weapons into that area that this will bring about more likelihood of peace? And we put an argument, well, no, we don't believe that is the case. In fact, we think it's going to make things absolutely 10 times worse. Hundreds of thousands of people, Ukrainian people, civilians as well as soldiers, as well as Russian working class people have been trumped into that war by the horrors of Putin and so on, and been killed and slaughtered, reminiscent really of the First World War in many, many ways. And then we say, well, we just said, no, we don't believe that is the case. And where do you stop here? If it's going to be cluster bomb, what next? Nuclear weapons. It seems to me the only way that you're going to win militarily inside inside Ukraine is if Ukraine has also nuclear weapons. And then, of course, if that happens, then we are really on the brink of a very serious situation. And I think that argument, will in the end won the day, that people understood that peace, whilst it might not look obvious that this is the way forward at this moment in time, but there are no shortcuts to peace. The only way we could bring a peace about, as we've shown throughout history, is where mass movements of ordinary working people, where create a movement where internationalism is at its heart and binds together to say, look, we don't want our warmongers in our name killing more people for their own economic and political interests. And therefore, that is a movement we need to build now. And as I say, it's difficult. It's not an easy argument. And I know in my own union, the backlash which therefore followed, which, by the way, people who should know bloody better, excuse my language here, which, was quite frankly disgrace. I mean, just the usual suspects of the right wing who don't like us and so on and so forth, actually, or pro-implicit, some people who I've been on demonstrations on many a time, who had decided they too would be very much opposed to this, and whilst they did not, many of them did not join in with these arguments, which after us, but really it became very strong. People, Starmer supporters and so on, on the Twitter feeds, on the just the harassment and the bullying. I've been around for many years. I've been in the Daily Mail being described as the one that in used to years one of the evil people history and all that kind of rubbish. I was described as somebody who was a communist and somebody who wants world peace. Well, got terrible things that I've been accused of here. But to get it done by people who on the so-called left, it just gets us rather concerned and rather confused that kind of atmosphere was whipped up. The question is why. I think is interesting, isn't it, really? Because it seems to me that they're very concerned. At the moment, there's such wall-to-wall coverage of Ukraine where there is no argument of the anti-war voices, which there are some, not many, but there are some inside Ukraine. I spoke with a guy called Yuri not long ago, a peace activist there who very much supports the motion we passed and is calling for peace. And there are others. We don't know how many others because they're not allowed to speak out inside Ukraine at this moment in time. But there is an anti-war voice inside Ukraine who is calling for peace. So it seems to me that is something in which, despite the difficulties here, we can start to win an argument which says there are no shortcuts, but there are ways through this. And it starts from recognizing that this war isn't simply a war about Ukraine and Russia. It's an inter-imperial rivalry, which is creating a very, very dangerous situation, which could spill over in all sorts of different ways. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. Just please stop me when you want to stop me. I don't know how long I'm meant to have here. 5 minutes, is it? 10 minutes, 5 minutes more, 3 minutes more?
Yeah, you can have a few minutes more. Yeah, that's fine.
Is that okay? All right. Okay. Well, very quickly. I mean, I think, as I say, that the backlash which was there, and it shows they're very concerned that too many people might catch on. Others might get a similar idea, and the emotions start to be braced elsewhere. So they're defensive. It shows that you can win the argument, but of course, you have to start somewhere. You have to put the argument first of all. Find the minority in your union branch. Find those people who do agree with you, and to build their confidence to try and take that argument through. I do think it's worth saying, really, that when you think about the TUC motion, which I started with, you can't have it both ways. It's either the left wants welfare, not warfare, or it wants warfare, not welfare. You see, but you can't have both. It seems obvious. You see, when the government, and they will and continue are doing so, coming to trade unionists and workers in education and workers in the health service, workers in local government, the welfare state more general, and saying we're putting up more money on arms so that we can continue to support Ukraine against Russia, where we'll have to therefore cut our wages, cut our services, and so on and so forth. That's the only argument they're going to put. Are we going to be in a stronger or weaker position if we are saying, actually, yes, we do support more arms into Ukraine? So it has a spillover effect on the arguments we have on a day-to-day basis, the economic arguments we face against this horrific government that is carrying things out. the TUC this year, hopefully UCU will be putting a motion trying to overturn the motion that the GMB passed, calling for more spending on arms. And if we do so, I hope that debate will continue and we will win that argument. The final thing I want to say, though, as I mentioned, what the Ukraine war has done has really created, gives more confidence, not just to the warmongers, the likes of Sunaks, the likes of Johnsons and so on and so forth, but also those within inside the trade union movement, pro-enforced, like the GMB leadership and others, who have a vested interest in ensuring there are more arms spending, as we've just heard from Derby and elsewhere. And I just remember, God, when I was 18 or so, 19, I can't honestly remember, but I was young, taking a group of workers from Barrow and Furness around the mines. I was in South Wales at the time, I lived in Cardiff, around the mines in 1984-85 miners' strike. And after 2-3 days collecting money and getting support and this sort of thing, I didn't know what they did. And I asked, I said, what do you work as? And they all looked rather shuffled their feet, heads down a little bit and so on and so forth. And they said, well, look, if we say something, tell you this, but don't make a big deal about it, because I understand it, people on the left and other workers don't really like what we do. I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, we make parts for nuclear submarines. I said, all right, okay, no, look, great, you should make that clear. And then the discussion unfolded. He said, look, we would absolutely like to use our skills with the very skilled workers and he at the time, I remember he talked about dialysis machines here. I could make kidney dialysis machines, something which could help humanity and not, wipe humanity off the face of the earth. That is something we'd much prefer to do. Unfortunately, I don't have control how I use my skills. And it seems to me, if we struggle and we fight and we win, then over the economic issues of pay and jobs and so on and so forth, the potential to then go further, to use that power to control or how we use our skills to save humanity and not kill it. Now, that memory always stays with me, because you see, I'm sure there are real fears in Derby as elsewhere that workers are concerned, that people like us argue for just transition, for diversification of weapons, of arms industry and the like, fear that basically if we ever got to that situation, if we had a government which implemented those things, the next day every job would be gone. And this is clearly not the case. It's such a ridiculous. I've been to the TUC conference on many occasions. The way these arguments are being put are fallacious, that just don't make any sense whatsoever. But unfortunately, I'm sure they find echo. So if there is a fear amongst rank and file workers in those industries we're talking about here, it is created by the leaderships of those unions who create a climate of fear around those issues. And our job, it seems to me, a patiently one, and I feel for the colleague from Derby who's campaigning heroically about these things. Ours is not about taking your jobs. It's the opposite. It's not only making sure that you have secure jobs, but jobs which you would like to use for the future. Now, that's a difficult one, but one I believe, at least abstractly amongst workers, you get nods and agreements. The reality sometimes is difficult, but when the government say it's either 1,000 jobs to submarines to kill people, nuclear submarines, or no jobs, that false argument, there is alternatives, there are different alternatives, and that's obviously part of our role, it seems to me, try to patiently put those arguments, and I do believe increasingly so. When we look around the world and the madness of the world at this moment in time, what weapons of mass destruction bring to the peace, the lives of ordinary people and so on and so forth, I believe we can win it. So peace to everybody, solidarity to everybody. I hope our small success at the UCU can start to give confidence to others to put those arguments. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Really appreciate that. And yes, I think we've all felt inspired by the success of UCU and getting that motion through. We know how difficult it's been in trade unions around this whole debate. And I think it's clearly about building that confidence as well. And I think just to pick up, obviously Moira talked about showing the plan. For those who don't know, the plan is about the new AUKUS aerospace workers shop stewards combine, who developed the alternative corporate plan in the 1970s. And I think there's always one line from Brian Salisbury in that film. He's one of the former shop stewards, which always stands out to me, which is, when you go to work, you just want a job and you're just thinking about earning your money. And when you're there for a while, you start to think about what you're doing. And that's when you start to question, about, what you're making and what your job is for. So, I think that there's an element which of course, we don't blame workers for what they're doing, but it's about having those choices. But and thanks again. So Sean is on holiday at the moment, so really appreciate you giving you some of your time this evening. So I'm just going to hand over to Vivian now, who's in the US. And again, thank you for joining us. And I'm pleased to say not at an awful time difference. Professor Vivian Price is actually a professor of interdisciplinary studies at California State University and one of the authors of a study decarbonizing and diversifying defence in the United Kingdom and United States, a workers' inquiry for a just transition. And just say in terms of trade union affiliation, Vivian is a member of the California Faculty Association and a retired International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers member. And I've known Vivian for a few years now, and it's really great to have Vivian come and talk about this research, which I think hasn't had enough attention given to it since it was released. So I'll hand over to you now, Vivian. Welcome.
Thanks so much. This has been a really interesting discussion. And, you know, I can definitely appreciate that we're facing many of the same challenges that you are in the UK. I had the pleasure of teaching at Liverpool University of Liverpool for a semester during a strike, and I was able to move quickly towards working on the picket line and teaching on the picket line. So I have a great respect for the work that professors as well as many other workers are doing around the country in the UK and now in the United States, mobilizing, organizing, striking, standing up for workers' rights. And I've been an anti-war activist since my youth and against the Vietnam War, in the streets, arrested, etc. And I've also, as an electrician, I've worked in defense industries. So I've had firsthand experience with not nuclear. Actually, as an electrician, I take it back. I worked in a nuclear power plant for a bit. So, but also in a weapons factory, building a weapons factory. So this is a huge dilemma, just like our sisters and brothers who work in refineries and in the fossil fuel industry. Thinking about transitions are very difficult. But what I want to share with you today is some perspective on what defense workers here in the United States are thinking. And I'm going to, probably the most important part of this is sharing some of the quotes, which I think you'll also recognize reverberate with the themes that you've discussed already. But it's a confirmation of this question of where do we go from here? So as a professor, I've made a PowerPoint. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully give you a chance to see a little bit more closely what we found. What do U.S. defense workers think about a just transition of the military? So let's see if I can. And as Sam pointed out, the name of the studies, Decarbonizing, Diversifying Defense in the UK and the US. I worked with Karen Bell, who's now at the University of Glasgow, and she was the lead on this and conducted the study in the UK. It was funded by the British Academy, and you might note that it took place before the Ukraine war really started. So things are a bit different now, but I believe most of the findings that we came up with are really still hold true. So the interviews were conducted by Zoom with a small sample, a total of about 58 workers, 28 in the United States, unionized workers, and several ex-military. And workers were found through cold calls to local unions and some referrals from union leaders. So they weren't picked because they had progressive views or the opposite, but they really were union members that were involved in their union. I could share this on the chat later. This is the full report where you can find the data and the findings. So the main method was a workers' inquiry, eliciting people's ideas about their lives and their work. There were also some focus groups of trade union leaders, scholars, and industry experts. But I'm focusing here on what workers were thinking. The questions we asked them had to do with, also how they got into this industry, but then what they thought about decarbonization, meaning the reduction of carbon emissions in the military, diversification or conversion, the broadening of defense sector to non-military business, and then just transition, which we define as the framework developed by trade unions and communities to secure workers' rights and livelihoods and community well-being when shifting to sustainable production. And I won't go into this today, but one of the things that we asked is, what do you think of the rhetoric or the attempts of the military to decarbonize? Because you read a lot about it. There are, it is a threat, right? The military is facing climate change problems in their bases and in their, being asked to decarbonize, seeing the phase out of oil in some remote way. And much of that is still greenwashing, but it's a separate question. I'm focusing more on how they feel about their industry eventually going this way. So in terms of the general findings, we did find strong common themes, and I'll highlight 3 of these. And this is no surprise. They want to hold on to their highly paid, high-craft unionized jobs. And this is probably the center of the dilemma. They are open to the transition to sustainability. There wasn't one person I spoke to that felt that climate change was not real, or that we need to transition. Moreover, they want to be consulted and involved in any moves to decarbonize or diversify the military. They want to be part of the conversation. They don't want this. They feel they have something important to contribute. However, defense workers do have a range of views about the industry and the future of the military and the importance of the military. So I've got 5 red slides, and in this case, red means stop or pro-defense. This is a slide on the defense and skepticism of sustainable transitions. So one thing that's doesn't need any more discussion is just the obvious point that many people in the military, as well as outside, accept the idea that defense is critical to the national security, although there are those who feel that actually the national security is jeopardized by the use of enormous amount of money, as Sean put it, warfare, not welfare. But by and large, there were definitely people who don't feel that way, and they feel that military is the way to guard the security of the nation. And then what was probably more interesting was to see the concern, the skepticism about diversification and decarbonization. They talked about the profit motive as a barrier to change. And I think that this is really something we need to talk about, is that the defense industry is making ginormous amount of money. In fact, it's state funded, our money, and it's private profits, socialism in reverse. So I think these 2 points are really critical to look at when we talk about the support for the support that nobody talks about in terms of the way the military is able to keep maintaining itself. They talked about the practical barriers to electrification, the huge number of different kinds of vehicles and facilities that would have to electrify, that seems quite overwhelming. And then that high cost of energy changeover. And the final point is that there's a little reinvestment in new industries. So since this study took place, there's been a climate bill, so-called, in the Inflation Reduction Act. And there are investments in new industries. I wouldn't say that they necessarily change the equation for the military. So again, something we can talk about. But this is what, I mean, basically the workers felt that the choices outside of defense were few and far between. So the defense industry is more secure than most. And here's a quote: "As long as we continue predominantly serving defense," this worker felt, "the plant is not going anywhere. I don't think my job is going anywhere. We've survived cuts. The cuts are never really that large, but we've survived changes in defense funding. We've made it through COVID primarily because we mostly are servicing defense programs." So quite a few of the plants that unions in plants throughout the country, I tried to reach people in, the East Coast, the South, the Midwest, the West Coast, had some industry that was not entirely defense. And that's where this came from, is that they felt that it was defense that floated, that was the secure part of the plants. So next slide is a summary of worker insecurity about losing the defense sector. And here are some of the points that people made. Highly skilled technical work is hard to reproduce in other sectors. It's not like making a toaster. Nothing pays as well. Offshoring, outsourcing, and automation are already a problem. There's a mismatch of skills and jobs in a transition, where on the one hand, you're dealing, with defense machinists, engineers, electricians, other skilled workers, and what may be in demand in a transition would be nurses, teachers, construction workers. So it's not as though you can move after your 25 years in one job to another job where you have no skills, and retraining is not something that people either necessarily want to go into a different career or feel that they can do. Work is also already leaving the United States. The union density is down, and environmental regulations are pushing work out. So here's a quote. "We're not making cars. We're not making toaster ovens. We're not making washing machines. The products we make, people's lives depend on." Thinking about soldiers. "They have to work every time they're used. No exceptions, no excuses. You can't bring it back and then get another Patriot missile. If it doesn't fire when it's supposed to fire, people are going to die." So it's a different mentality in the industry. So this is, the pride of craft, the pride of making something that goes through so much quality control that is so different from what other things that we see in our economy. And this is a fear that workers have, that they're, as again, Sean alluded, that there's a demand for this and it has to be highly technical. And, people don't think about dialysis machines. And, the AUKUS plan is not well known in the United States. But again, this is the question of insecurity and the importance of technical skill. So workers are already afraid. Here was one worker who said it is actually scary. And, the more years I've worked in this industry, I'm more scared. In the beginning, we did everything. We made everything. Everything was done in the US. We had so much work, we didn't know what to do with it. There are thousands and thousands of employees. Since then, we're offshoring. And instead of dealing with the environmental issue, they'll just send the work to another country that doesn't have the same restrictions that we do. And now our work goes everywhere. It feels like it's going everywhere but here. So another idea of, holding on to what people already feel is moving away. And then just sort of an in-between point is that unions are ambivalent about taking a just transition stand. And we hear that. We hear that In the construction industry, we hear that, in the fossil fuel industry in general, and we hear it in the military. I think the unions, this worker says, look at it as we'll lose all these members and we'll lose all these jobs. And they feel, they're supposed to represent their members. This worker said, I think there's another way to get around that. And that's just by simple, honest communication and showing them jobs are still there. So I'd say this is probably, again, the crux of the dilemma is, what are those jobs and where are they being developed and how do we get them to, to be developed? So now we're looking at the more hopeful side, the workers' support for transitioning the sector to greater sustainability. And this is a 5-series slide. There's a need to decarbonize and reduce waste. Some of the workers talked about the enormous amount of waste that takes place in these, factories that generate extraordinary amount of scrap. They would love to do something socially productive. Again, an echo of a previous comment. The concept of the peace dividend, that we need to do something better with these funds. And of course, the awareness of climate threats. But the workers want to continue to have equally skilled, secure, and well-paid jobs. One worker talked about how he feels very mismatched in terms of his politics and his work. I'm in a weird place because my politics don't really line up with the work that I do. On the one hand, I'm very grateful that I have such a secure job in a secure industry. But on the other hand, it would be wonderful if my job didn't necessarily have to exist. And I certainly did talk to a number of people like this. One person said it the best. Another has talked about loving to have a socially productive job. I would be happy to lose this job and find another. And if it was in a renewable resource, a research sector, that would be fantastic. I would feel better about my life if I did that. We also heard that people feel that the US priorities are wrong. If we weren't spending as much on defense, or if we were taking that money and putting it towards social needs, those could have a great impact on the quality of life for most Americans in terms of stuff like national health care and a lot of the safety net things that say most countries in Europe take for granted because they don't spend as much money on weaponry as we do. In the United States, if you lose your job, you lose your health care. And unless you're over 65, you have to buy it, and it's extraordinarily expensive. And, many of the healthcare plans are very, poor. So healthcare is a huge reason why people stay in jobs that they don't like. So finally, solutions and optimism. On the question of ideas, more and more people see the need to address climate change and are concerned about their kids. And furthermore, a lot of their children are saying, we've got to do something, mom and dad. We're heads in the sand. And, people express the fact that their children were questioning what they did. And another point was more and more workers are getting angry and getting more active and recognizing their power. This is a phenomenon that has exploded in many countries since the study was done. It's happening in the United States. In terms of actions to reallocate the budget to renewables and decrease military engagement, to shrink the military, and that unions and working people are the ones who, once they commit to change, can turn things around. And I just want to share with you, I do work with a number of activist groups, and one of my retired sheet metal worker friends is very active in Veterans for Peace, and shared a project that they're working on to bring veterans, labor unions, and other worker organizations together around a program to cut the Pentagon budget and move the money to address climate crisis, fund human needs, and create good family supporting jobs. And last but not least, expose how corporate rule is against the interests of labor, peaceful resolution of conflict on the planet. And this is the bill. One of our senators, Barbara Lee, who was the one who single-handedly was the only vote against the war in Iraq, sponsored this bill. It stands no chance of passing in the Congress, but it popularizes and builds support for the idea of sensible spending priorities and organizes and educates around this issue to have an actual bill. And here are the tenets of that bill. If you're interested, there's a email, labor@veteransforpeace.org, that you can take a look at. And I'll leave it at that. So thanks so much for giving me a chance to talk about this study. I, like Sam, feel like there are some very important lessons that are in it, and I will share the URL in the chat. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Vivian. Really appreciate that. And I think so, it's so important to hear a view from the US side, because certainly within the wider AUKUS debate, it's welcoming that Australian trade unions are certainly opposing the new submarines and UKUS submarines, but we're struggling to really find people from the US and trade unions from the US to talk about this. But I think just getting these insights about what workers themselves are feeling in these sectors is incredibly important. So I think we've got a couple of questions raised in the chat. I know that just before go to those, I know Maura just wanted to add a couple more points as well, and Sean has to go around about 8 o'clock, so I'll bring Sean back in after that if there's anything you want to respond to specifically, Sean. Maura, do you want to come in? You're still muted.
Okay, right. I just wanted to very quickly add that the announcements about what was going to happen with Rolls-Royce and Derby, there've been two different ways of putting it. The first announcement was very much about new plans to almost double the size of Raynesway, and it was planned major expansion of the submarine section, etc. Supplier of nuclear reactor plants to power attack submarines as part of the tri-national AUKUS. However, the rest and other stuff has really emphasized that what they're going to be doing is working on climate change issues. So it's peaceful use of nuclear power. And so it's like, that's what they're pushing now. That's what they're really about. I just wanted to say too that with the showing of the film, the trade union response wasn't really thought out. I don't think there's been, the person who was supposed to speak had another engagement, he said. He had spoken previously when we had Bruce Kent at a meeting in Matlock at county offices, and went away after Bruce hugged him in there. So yeah, I don't know about trade union responses or how to get involved with them in Derby. I really don't. The other part I want to just mention quickly was that part of the announcement was about the Derby Nuclear College. And we don't know what we're going to do about that, or, getting involved, talking to some students to see what opinions there are there. And just picking up on something Vivian mentioned about in America, during the miners' strike, I was living in Clay Cross, and pit closures were announced, etc. And I can't remember the name of the guy who was doing all the shouting, probably a Freudian slip, but the miners themselves realized that loads of the smaller pits and some of the bigger ones were nearly used up, and they knew they had to think about other ways of working. But some of the leadership stopped it. Okay, that's really all I wanted to add there. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Moira. Yeah, it's really helpful to have those additional points as well. And yeah, and I think that's what we all need to be thinking about, what we can do in Derby specifically, and obviously, you know, wider to support our fights against this and increased military spending. It just reminds me of, I think there was one quote in the wider report that obviously Vivian's just spoken about, is that I think one worker in the UK commented there's always a magic money tree for defence spending, and that as we can see, and certainly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen that there are no limits on the money that can become available for defence spending, and the corporations are certainly making huge profits at the moment, which is, as Vivian pointed out, little discussed. So I just wanted to bring Sean back in before he has to leave us. And I know there's some points gone in the Q&A, so I'll leave it to you, Sean, to really just respond to anything you want to, really.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just reading. Oh, yeah, can they have? So the first question from Daniel: can we overturn the TUC policy? Are you asking, is that in terms of technically, or in terms of the possibility of winning an argument? Technically, I think you can. I mean, you put motions to Congress one year, you get them support, you turn up next year and somebody puts a different one to try and overturn that motion. I assume that applies to the TUC as well. But I assume you're making more of a general point. Is it potential to win an argument with the TUC? Yeah, I do. You know, I mean, so I wasn't at last year's TUC conference. I'd been quite a few years before that, and there was a general shift, you know, around the debates around just transition, the debates around diversification and so on. You know, it was much more progressive motions that were passed. Campaigns like the campaign against climate change, the trade union campaign against climate change and so on. All these types of groups and organizations have reasonable good fringe meetings and have more support than they've done forever. I mean, we put a motion to the TUC. The first one was was what, 2019, or was it 20, just before COVID, where we got a unanimous position for a day of action, a 30-minute day of workday protest. That was called workday protest, in support of the school students who are taking strike action. It was taken unanimously. So I give this example to show you that I think, you know, the motion was passed last year is really out of sync, and that's why it's worrying, because it starts to claw back the motions that have been put before. A more general point, though. You see, I am actually very, you know, as socialists and active trade unions, we have to be confident about our ideas and, you know, optimistic. But it's not just for me, but it's the glass half empty, half full. I genuinely believe we're in a period of history whereby we can start to really make inroads into these arguments than we've ever done before. I was on the T&D demonstrations in the 1980s and the early 70s and the like. And it was difficult then. Things were going against us in many ways. But I do think when, you know, people, all you have to do is switch on the TV now and see the horrors of the impact of climate change, from what's happened in Greece to when you look at the huge spread of wildfires across the planet and so on. You see the impact of the ecological crisis impacting everyday life. This is not just a bunch of well-to-do, you know, middle-class people who just a little bit like the environment or something. You know, this is way beyond this now. It is about working class people's lives, their impact, and how they can respond to that. And the danger is here, we like COVID and everything else, we can end up normalizing this world, you know, that we normalize an ecological crisis, we normalize the impact of pandemics across. This is the new normal. Well, no, it's not a new normal, and we have to, and a lot of people clearly understand it. Not only must it not be a new
We have just lost Sean, unfortunately. Okay, so I think we'll just move on and hopefully Sean may be able to come back to us before the end. Just to update, I hadn't realised Maura also has to leave at 8, unfortunately. So we'll pick up some more questions, but of course we might lose Maura and Sean, unfortunately, before we close. I don't know if you've had a chance, Vivian, to look through the questions, but I think there was one there from Carol Turner that talks about the GMB and how they handle the issue, and it kind of relates to a couple of other questions that have been put as well around transferable skills and around decommissioning work. And I know certainly in terms of the Derby College, there has been a question about, you know, obviously whilst we're opposed to nuclear in all its forms, you know, nuclear will not go away. Even if we shut everything down tomorrow, because there is enormous legacy of nuclear in the UK and of course across the world. So I don't know if you want to come back on a few of those points, Vivian, if you've had a chance to see them.
I'd be happy to, but if Moira has to leave, why don't we ask her to, if there's anything you'd like to say, Moira. But you're muted. Still muted. Okay.
Better? Okay. I really haven't got anything else to add. I mean, we had an East Midlands CND meeting at the weekend, and they're going to take on board. It's not just a Derby issue, as I know you're recognising, but we don't know how to campaign, because jobs are jobs. Jobs are very important. I even remember when my own dad, who was a very proud tradesman, when I got to grammar school, he actually went to work as a spot welder for Hanley Page Bombers the very year I started campaigning with CND, 1959. You know, I just don't know. I was hoping that some of you might come up with ideas about how we do. I was disappointed after the film, The Plan in Derby, that we didn't have more people from the union, from Rolls-Royce there, and that the ones who did come didn't have much to say, felt compromised. The people who could have spoken stayed away, obviously feeling too compromised. So, yeah, sorry, nothing else to add, just confusion, Sam, sorry.
No, that's fine, Maura. We, you know, obviously we've been covering addressing defence diversification for a long time, and you know, and it's obviously part of this broader discussion, particularly in the context of today's world, but and now linked clearly to climate change. And before we lost you, Sean, obviously you were making the points about what's going on at the moment. We're all witnessing with the devastation across southern Europe with climate change impacts, and obviously in America as well. And for those who are questioning that we've got a very cool July, saying climate change clearly doesn't exist, we've got a cool July because of climate change and the jet streams, but that's a different discussion to start going into. But I know you've got to go as well, Sean, so we'll just bring you back in quickly before you got to go, and then we'll come to Vivian to wrap up on comments. Thanks.
I really do apologize. It just went at that key moment. I was finishing my last sentence, but yeah, all I was trying to accept. My view is, I think we're in a good position. I totally understand what the colleague was saying and the comrade was saying, the difficulties they face since 1959. Hats off, or 59, I think you said, been campaigning for those years. I mean, it's amazing experience in this room. I just think, you know, the level of struggles that are taking place, the experience of ordinary working people, the level of struggle which have risen in Britain and elsewhere, does mean the collective action of workers. Not only those questions are being asked, but then therefore they feel they have the confidence to be able to do something about it. I mean, that is the key factor, isn't it? It's about confidence. When workers don't feel confident to come to the meeting to raise concerns about the issues which they face, all that is what trade unions should be about. If you have a leadership, as you do in the GMB and other union leaderships who run those industries, who are creating a climate fear rather than putting an argument to saying, look, you should be using your skills in this way. We shouldn't have to put up with this. The world is crazy. We don't want to pour more fuel onto the fire here. If they were putting that argument, those workers feel far more confident to be able to take on their own employers and the governments to use their skills in their own way. So I think we've got a sort of a situation whereby the world itself is literally on fire. There are more wars taking place. The experience of workers is there, and there's a rising tide of organized collective struggle. And those two things does give us the opportunity to get a wider hearing for those arguments. And that's why it's so important to take the motions to the TUC Congress this year to actually put it right or wrong that this trade union movement in England, in Britain, does not support the increase of arms bonding. At the heart of our movement is an internationalism, and you can't have internationalism if you're supporting motions that call for more arms, killing other workers from other places. Wars are all about the killing of the poor and the unemployed of one country, killing and maiming the poor and the unemployed of another. And that should be the central focus, central arc of any trade union movement. And as I say, I think we're in a very good position to start to put those arguments and win them. So thanks for everybody. I've learned a lot tonight, and appreciate you for inviting me to speak.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. And yeah, absolutely. I don't think we disagree with that at all. And thank you again for joining us. And thank Moira. If you have to slip away, then yep, don't worry. Yeah, so over to you, Vivian, to come back on some of the points.
Yes. Well, in terms of decommissioning, again, I think, we see this in the oil industry as well. Telling oil workers that, well, they can still keep their jobs decommissioning is not a tremendously met with enthusiasm among the workers. I think this is the problem that, even thinking about professors, right? If we are told that, it's going to be much better for students, which we probably would debate, for robots to be teaching, for us all to have, been, we would be incredibly threatened. I don't think we can minimize the point that people who have jobs that have fought for many decades to have good conditions, relatively speaking, or at least tiers of people with good conditions, are going to, believe that there will be jobs if they don't exist. We have to build an alternative, form of economy. I think we have to fight for good pay and good benefits for nurses and for daycare workers and for the people in the care economy. That is going to be the growth industry, right? I don't think the military is alone in this situation. As far as, some of the questions, I see Mariam has pointed out this idea of that the cluster bombs are still manufactured. I don't think people will be, persuaded to work in areas not considered illegal by most countries. They might be ashamed, but at the end of the day, they get their paycheck and they can feed their families. And there probably are people who would not do that work, and they're not there now. Maybe, and as things change, I think the other thing is that the military is a workers' issue. I was at a meeting of a labor just transition convergence this past weekend, and we had the building trades unions and environmental justice folks in the room. And one of the questions was, well, where is the money going to come from to create this alternate economy? And how do we build momentum for that? How do we make sure that environmental justice communities, people who are, dealing with the pollution and the fires, et cetera, are not going to be dismissed because of lack of money? And someone brought up, what about the military as a source of revenue? It's enormous. I do think that we should talk about the defense industry, the military industrial complex, as a profit-making organization for private contractors using taxpayer dollars. I think that that's, to me, that's probably the least discussed and the most egregious part of this. I saw another point about, this dilemma of concern for the Ukraine. And I spent some time in Norway this past year and earlier, and met, many people from across Europe who were, generally concerned that, people in the Ukraine needed to be defended. However, you could make an argument that it didn't have to come to war, right? But, kind of going backwards, and that there will be other wars just like the Ukraine if we don't change the way we think about security. So those are some of the things I would point out.
Thanks, Vivian. Yeah, that's really helpful. And of course, that is about the central message of peace. And certainly in terms of nuclear, there is no peace and there is no security. And that's why we have to fight back and find a way to build the arguments for that alternative as well. I was just going to bring in Annie Tunnicliffe, who's actually here on the screen. So Annie, if you want to come in, I know you wanted to make a few points to Moira, who unfortunately has had to go, but this has been recorded, and of course they can be passed on to Moira afterwards around what we can do to support Derby C&D. So over to you.
Yes, I'll email her. I haven't told her yet. At a very, very early stage, one of the things that we're going to try and do, which I hope will support Moira and Derby C&D, as well as going wider, is to try and get the Australian trade unions to do an open letter to their comrades in this country, which we can distribute to, because that would be one way we might be able to get into the unions. I think at the moment, as she said, it's extremely difficult for us to do that. But if that message comes from other trade unionists who are resisting AUKUS and resisting the nuclear jobs and saying they want to do things that are socially useful, if that message comes from other unionists, I think that would have much more impact than us saying it. As I say, it's a very early stage. We haven't even asked them yet, but I just wanted one positive thing because it felt very depressing, particularly for Moira, I think, feeling a bit embattled. So I will tell her that that's what we're working on, and I'll let people know if it goes anywhere. The only other thing I wanted to say is about language, and I think we need to stop calling it the defence industry. We need to start calling it either the war industry or the arms industry, because it's not about defence. Most of the time, 99% of the time, it's about what Vivian called, the profit motive, the private profit. And of course they need wars because they're going to have to make more of it. So yeah, language, it's important. It influences how we think. So no more defence. That's it. Thanks.
Right. Very good.
Thanks, Annie. Yes, and I probably should just let others know. Annie actually convenes the C&D Trade Union Advisory Group. That's why she obviously wants to say a bit more about what was happening there. I think I just saw actually a question for me in the chat. So I was just going to come to this, and this is from Pam Flynn. It's about PCS is pressing for a just transition ministry in a future government, and asked if I could touch on this. I'm just going to do that very briefly, and just to say what PCS is discussing at the moment is this notion of a national climate service, which those of you familiar with the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign will know that this is a demand of that campaign since its inception in 2009, and that campaign was a response to the environmental and financial crisis, obviously following the financial crash in 2007-2008. So what the union is actually looking at the moment, and it's very early stages, but it's looking at the kind of institutional governance and architecture, if you like, to actually come up with this kind of really transformative transition that we need, and building this alternative, because and whether that's in defence or arms, military, whichever we call it, or whether that's to do with climate change. Clearly we don't have a plan, and clearly we don't have the systems in place to give that kind of not just confidence to workers about transition, and we are already in transition in terms of climate change and the energy transition. That's already happening. Just workers are not the forefront of that, but also about that there is a role for workers and trade unions to be leading on that, about the things that we do want to be producing, and producing in the kind of broadest sense, you know, for social need and not for profit as well. And I think that very much goes back to the heart of that point which Vivian has made, and I see others are agreeing with, around obviously the public investment which goes into this industry, which is being taken away. You know, we're told there's no money for the NHS, there's no money for public services, there's no money for pay, etc., etc. But there's always money. Obviously, it's not just in the defence sector, but primarily always in the defence sector. And obviously, with the jobs in Derby, that's been underwritten by the MOD as well. So, you know, again, that's money which is coming without any accountability or any public discussion really about where that funding goes. And this was actually a point which was brought out by the former Lucas Aerospace workers as well when they were developing their alternative corporate plan, is that, you know, a lot of the money actually is public money, and we don't have any debate about who gets to say where that money is spent. So I think now, unless there's any and Miriam said public finance or private profit is an important starting point, and absolutely, yeah, come back, Vivian, please do.
No, I think another point that wasn't raised so much in this study, but which I know is the case here in the United States, and I don't know how much it is in the UK, is that the military is seen as a career development scheme for young people in the working class and the poor, and you know, I mean, it's another reason why people defend the military. At least there's the military that will help my young son or daughter, you know, get a head start, because I don't have the money to send them to college. You know, what are the answers for young people who either don't want to go to college or can't join the Air Force? I just met a young man yesterday in Phoenix who was, you know, where it was 118 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite high in Celsius as well. And I asked him, he was working in a Wendy's, a fast food place, the only place that seemed to offer anything that was affordable in the airport. I asked him how he was dealing with the heat, and he said that he had to run at night because it was so hot, and he was preparing to go into the Air Force. And I asked him why he was going to the Air Force, and he said, you know, to show my younger sister that there is a possibility of advancement, you know, that I could have a career, that she might have a career. You know, and I just talked to somebody else this morning repeating that story, and she was saying, you know, I had the same thing. My oldest son wanted to go to college. I made too much money, so he couldn't get a scholarship, and it cost too much for me to pay for it, or him. So he went into the Air Force for 10 years. And I mean, this is the other thing, that the military does have support, not only because it creates jobs, but it creates opportunities for working class people not to have to work in be unemployed or work in a dead-end job. There's got to
Thanks,
be
ma'am.
another way for us to organize our economy so that that's not why people look up to the military.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously certainly working class, and it's been a recruiting ground for the military in the UK as well. I'm not saying I don't have enough knowledge to say whether that's a driver, but certainly in working class communities where there's few alternatives, and there are a number of campaigns about demilitarizing education and stopping the military going into schools in the UK as well. So I think that's another added point as well. So we need to be providing those alternatives for young people, and also to get into education and do the things that they want to do and explore learning. There's a whole debate in the UK at the moment about cutting certain university courses, which is obviously not the place here to go into, but all sort of feeds into some of those discussions. So I think we're just coming up to 8:15, and that's been really great, and thanks for all those points made and questions in the Q&A, and I think we can draw some stuff out of there. I know, as Annie said, Maura feels probably a bit disheartened there's not more coming out about what we can do, but I think we all know that this is a huge challenge, and particularly with the context we're in at the moment. So but I think just raising the profile of the issues and making sure this is part of a national debate and not seen as a Derby issue, and that we link into this as well as we are, other things across C&D about the nuclear warheads being placed at Lakenheath, for example, is making sure that this becomes part of a national conversation and not localized. So I think that's our challenge, and it's our challenge as trade unionists as well, to make sure that we can take inspiration from people like Sean, who've got difficult motions through their union, to keep battling away with those. I mean, if it's just in branches or trades councils, and actually the National Trades Council Conference passed a very good motion as well this year around defence diversification, which is not going forward to TEC Congress, unfortunately. On TEC Congress, we will know probably in the next week or so which motions are up for debate. The agenda should be published shortly. So that will give us a chance to start obviously having a look at those. But obviously building knowledge and building our contacts and links is really important. And there was a question about obviously nuclear education as well, and there is C&D does provide resources around that equally. So if there's any links and stuff, certainly the links to the research that Vivian was involved with and others that we can send out afterwards, I'm sure we can speak to the C&D office to help get those links and any other follow-up stuff communicated. So I should say thank you to you all. Thank you to our speakers. Only Vivian left, unfortunately. And do appreciate it's holiday time, so it's great to have seen so many of you on this call, and hopefully we'll be having more of these and following up, and obviously building our responses and our international solidarity and connections as well, because it's very important that we continue to have these with our comrades in the US and comrades in Australia, as we have done in other meetings as well, and starting to build a bigger international response around this. And the letter that Annie's mentioned may hopefully just be a part of that, and maybe something we can talk about doing with US unions as well at some stage. So thank you all again, and I will say goodbye.
Hi, Sam. I think I've managed to make sure there's no attendees. I don't think there's a way of just like removing all the attendees to have a post-mortem. I think very often this webinar just has to close. So that's what my experience anyway. But I thought actually it would be politer to say goodbye.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I was wondering that, but yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
Well, the tech went okay.
it went fine. Obviously, we had one speaker who was a bit well, we lost him once, but that was it. It didn't look sloppy at all. It was fine. So I think that all worked well. Is this still recording? I'm going to stop recording.